It's a rare sight, but here we have it. I can safely say Grid Autosport is the best racing sim I've played on Switch so far. It sounds like faint praise given the lack of competition so far, but it does happen to be an excellent port of the last gen release from 2014. Feature complete with hundreds of DLC tracks and cars, developer Feral Interactive seems to have gone the extra mile to adjust the game to the handheld in every way possible. Small extras like HD rumble and gyro controls are a plus, but it goes much further, down to HD texture packs and a slew of performance modes. More than any racer I've tried in recent years, regardless of console, this port gives you the options to enjoy it the way you want. So I figured let's dig in to see what works and what doesn't. First up, let's clear up any confusion on what this game actually is. PS4, Xbox One and PC get a full series reboot, simply called Grid. It uses the latest build of the Ego engine, every track is sculpted from the ground up, the lighting model is vastly improved, and, while there's an overlap in circuits, it's an entirely different game. I've covered it as a beta, though this is the final code running on base PS4 at 30 FPS. Rather than port this to the Switch, what we have instead there is a solid alternative. It's a deluxe conversion of the 360 and PS3 game Grid Autosport. Now, this landed during that twilight era of the last generation, and as such it never got a release on PS4 or Xbox One. Today on Switch though, we get a kind of greatest hits version of that game. Feature complete, it's bolstered by new modes and a fully updated track list, and technically speaking, it fits too. I think it's a good pairing for the GPU power of Nintendo's hybrid, elevating a past success to greater heights, rather than struggling to hit the mark with a conversion of the reboot. A big part of the attraction here is the options. Feral Interactive is really on point here. Autosport is packed into a tiny 6.3GB install, but there's an extra 2.8GB download if you'd like it, with the option of an HD texture pack from the eShop. Everything you see here is running with those higher spec textures, a pretty smart use of Switch's 3.5GB of RAM. Sadly, we're missing online and local multiplayer at launch, a bit of a shame given last gen at least had local split screen. And yet, more options are coming down the line, with promise of an update to add these in for free. We'll see how that turns out. For now though, what's really in focus for this analysis is the playback options. We have one for graphics and another for performance, which I'll cover later. Plus, if you play Switch as a handheld, you get an extra mode called Energy Saver. This game does have a legacy on iOS and Android platforms, and so it makes sense the Switch gets the benefits of the work done there, used as a portable. As a game, it happens to hold up really well too. Handling is spot on in my time using the Pro Controller. Drifting a corner feels satisfying and the HD rumble is properly tailored to it. Even car collision physics are well worked into the game. Looking back to the PS3 version here, you can see the ambition Codemasters had for the project in 2014 in its post effects too. Velocity based motion blur was in then, and so it goes on Switch with a refined form of the effect on camera movement. Screen space effects like water splashes, lens flare, chromatic aberration all jump straight across too. Between PS3 and Switch, it's surprising how close the two are in geometric detail. Buildings, cars and everything in between seem to jump right across. Shadows are improved on Switch at least, and texturing on faraway objects benefit from that HD texture pack with clearer signs. I'm running on Switch's graphics mode by the way, the best it can look, and the fact is both sides here are running at 30 frames per second, slowed down for the sake of comparison. The key difference is though, PS3 runs at 30 FPS with an adaptive VSync, adding screen tearing up and down the frame, whereas Switch is fully VSynced with no artifacts. The other big discrepancy is the resolution side. PS3 always ran at around 1280 by 720, pretty standard for last gen racing sims. What Switch gets away with is impressively a full 1080p upgrade, a native 1920 by 1080. Sure, texture filtering is similar between the two, but look to the distance in the Chicago circuit and there's no contest in clarity. The presentation is much clearer on the right side at a 2.25 times increase in pixels for Switch. So all things considered, not bad. It's not the grid reboot, but it is a kind of mid-gen step in its technical design. It's the best home console version too, and to back that up, there's a few ways you can play it. Docked under a TV, Switch has two modes. Regardless of which you pick, you get that 1920 by 1080p picture while docked, or 1280 by 720 while portable. The graphics mode gives you a 30fps experience with the works in post effects, depth of field, motion blur, and even a vignetting effect. But supposing you want to shoot for 60fps, the performance mode has you covered with an unlocked frame rate that gets you most of the way there. More on how it fares later, but here are the two compared side by side with Switch docked, and really the difference is night and day. For performance mode to stand a chance of hitting 60fps, a lot gets stripped out. All those post effects, notably motion blur, leave the image looking a lot clearer but also sharper. It's still 1080p either way, but post treatment of edges is lower quality, breaking up subpixel detail and fences more obviously. You'll also notice car shadows are removed entirely in performance mode. Actually, that's a big one. The dynamic shadow from sunlight is cut away entirely, something that sticks out like a sore thumb. Ambient shade stays underneath it either way, but here graphics mode still uses high quality sharper outlines for them. All things considered, it's impressive how much is cut out. The depth of field is gone, but at least reflections on the car bonnet stay at the same resolution. These are mostly GPU focused settings, and so it's curious that 1080p stays either side. There is another variable though in how portable play runs. Now to repeat, taking Switch as a pure handheld, the native resolution drops to 720p in every mode. The settings differences are also the same as their docked equivalents, whether that's graphics or performance, but a new mode unlocks while handheld, on top of the original two, called Energy Saver. It's simple enough. The game's capped at 720p and 30fps, and all settings are dragged down pretty much as low as they can go. Compare them all together and you can see worse texture filtering and anti-aliasing than even the performance mode. It's everything you could feasibly do to ease load on the GPU, besides drop the res lower than 720p. Clearly a note taken from the way mobile games are made, but I can really see this coming in handy for future Switch games. All of this does a lot to pin Grid Autosport down as the best racing sim on the market for Switch, not just for the fact it's absolutely robust in its mechanics and with a huge roster of cars, but also because you can play it in so many ways. My only gripe with it right now is that, well, there's no multiplayer for the time being, and also to be frank, that the frame rate isn't 100% perfect. So let's take a look at what we've got to start in graphics mode. Booting it up while docked, it's pretty hard to complain most of the way through. The tough bit, as always, is in the starting grid with all 12 cars in view. If anything's going to buckle, it's here. It's got a solid lock almost constantly, and I've got to say adding that motion blur in really helps with that 30fps by blending each frame. There's the occasional frame time spike to 16 milliseconds, but really it's so rare. The most egregious drop, and pretty much the only one I've caught, was on the loop in Chicago. Collisions ahead of the starting grid are really what kick it off, down to the mid-20s. In all likelihood, this is a CPU problem in dealing with the physics and AI all in one moment. It sticks out really obviously, but outside of these moments, it's pretty solid all round. Graphics mode on Switch is generally better to play than the last gen PS3 version, which had these drops plus screen tear and only rendering at 720p. So in most respects, it's still an upgrade over the last console release. What if you want to gun for 60fps then? Well, to be blunt, you're not getting that from Switch, regardless of mode. The performance mode drops so many settings, but the bottom line is you're getting 45 to 60fps most of the way through, and typically that's 50 to 60. The worst case stuff is reserved for the big city races. Specifically, it's the quick sprints of the grid leading up to the first turn. Without that blur to disguise it, every frame drop weighs harder on the sense of fluid motion. The rule of thumb is the same as most racing games. You'll get closer and closer to 60fps the more you splinter away from the pack, and especially if you stay in pole position. What's telling though is you'll see these sizable hiccups, showing there's a CPU bottleneck somewhere in drawing all this terrain in so quickly. 60 FPS is just about attainable then, but the bad news is it's not a constant. As an option, it's nice to have performance mode, and on average I preferred playing it that way. The big question for me seeing this is, how does dropping the resolution to 720p in portable play help, if at all? Obviously there are fewer pixels to push while on the move, but the fact is, if it's a CPU bottleneck, there shouldn't be much of a change. And so it goes. With graphics mode, the extent of most performance hiccups are hidden by that 30 FPS cap. There are very occasional drops under, but it's generally a consistent way to play. Likewise, the energy saver mode more or less follows the same pattern. It's on paper the least likely to drop, given the settings are pretty much bottomed out. So what of performance mode while portable? Let's check it out. The turnout based on close testing here is more or less the same as docked play at 1080p. Performance mode while portable runs between 45 and 60 FPS again, and it shows the GPU is likely not the limit to Switch running this game. It's uncanny how close it is to docked, and again shows there's just no easy way to squeezing 60 FPS out of the game. At the very least, I found playing on the smaller display made the drops harder to spot, and overall I'd say it's still a preference. For all the settings it offers, Grid Autosport is the best Switch has to offer in the racing sim space right now. It could take some beating too. The effort put into the port shows that Feral Interactive were given time to properly flesh out the ideas it had for Switch, and better still, there should be even more to come with that multiplayer mode update. Accepting the performance mode as it is, and yes, it's a shame we can't get a locked 60 FPS, it goes far beyond what the last gen versions could ever achieve. I suppose there's always that question over how the Grid reboot might have looked. Cut into shape for the Tegra X1's capabilities, it would have been fascinating to see, but perhaps not practical for Switch. As a stand-in, what we have in Grid Autosport instead is very robust, and well worth checking out. That's all I have time for today. If you did find this analysis useful or insightful in any way, please let me know by liking or subscribing. And don't forget to hit the bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a pristine, high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly with me or the team, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.